this is pretty significant. Plato is obvious in terms of his philosophy of forms, the idea that ideas have this sort of eternal, unchanging existence that happens outside of our real existence. For example, like you'd have the idea of a table, and like that table has a form, which is the perfect, infinite, ultimate table, and all physical tables are just representations of that, essentially. Where it and we can kind of see that come a little bit into the whole Bornless thing, the idea that this is, what we are invoking is something that precedes all phenomenal existence. What's really even more significant is when we look at Spinoza. He's an interesting philosopher in the sense that pretty much everyone has a great deal of respect for him. I think he's the only philosopher I've ever seen Nietzsche speak kindly of, or at least not insult directly. Look, we're talking about like one of the most supremely critical guys in the history of philosophy, and he still has good things to say about Spinoza. Spinoza's idea of God or the divine, he identifies with what he called the substance, and he usually hyphenates as in substance, what stands beneath all things. His whole argument for the existence of God is that God has to be necessary, in the sense that being is not, like, it's the precondition for being, and he doesn't define God as a creator necessarily, but he's like, okay, things exist, so that condition of existence is how I will define God, because, like, just existence, existence in and of itself. And he makes a pretty strong argument for this idea, although really he isn't trying to justify an idea of God and more taking the idea of existence and identifying it with God, which is a little easier to kind of swallow in many cases. But one of the things he says, it has to be eternal and self-created. So this comes back to the idea of bornless. Like, that is without beginning, that is necessary in and of itself. And sort of that's his like most basic concept of the divine. In terms of actually like looking at this in terms of the barbarous names and doing the ritual, what people find usually right away is Crowley makes some interesting additions. He has these little sort of poetic sayings that come after the names, and that different people have different opinions about this. I actually think that they're quite useful to use. They're not part of the traditional text at all. They're interpretations that Crowley added on later. But this is where we have to pay attention to the idea that Crowley's saying, well, you know, I used this ritual this way and this is the result that I got. So again, historically accurate or not, like that's what we should be paying more attention to. And I would definitely say that it's important for people to like come up with their own interpretations, come up with their own ideas, pack the information in Crowley's stuff into it, certainly. But I think that doing it the traditional way, the traditional way, doing it Crowley's way for a while before you get cute with it is definitely a good idea. This is where we make a distinction between the names, the barbarous names, and like the titles that we see there. So like there are certain points in the rubric of the rituals that we are addressing different titles and different ideas. You can kind of play with that a little. The names themselves, not so much. And one thing that came up when I was talking about this is the concept of vibration and basically the Golden Dawn system, which is just an opportunity for me to address this in general. The Golden Dawn had these documents called the Z2 documents that they used to invoke spirits. And in this version of these documents, when you're trying to talk to a particular spirit or an angel or whatever, you vibrate the name letter by letter. You structure the ritual around those letters of the name of the spirit that you're trying to deal with. So like different stages of the ritual should be connected to different letters of the name and so on and so forth. This kind of comes from something John Dee had, where he's getting instructions how to work with the Enochian tablets. And the Golden Dawn really expanded their idea of the Enochian tablets, and they added like zodiacal and elemental attributions to each of the squares and whatnot, and that wasn't in the original text, but is, I think, useful. I think it's useful to look at it like that. But that's part of the reason it connects to these Z2 things, where you're doing it letter by letter. This kind of got, the distinction of doing this kind of got lost when the Golden Dawn was working their version of Enochian magic. So like when you do the Enochian calls, they would do it letter by letter in the call as well, where it's actually quite explicit in the text. That's not what you're supposed to be doing when you're doing the Enochian calls and whatnot. So this kind of like gets expanded into everything. So there are people who take this, and any time they do any kind of invocation, they're doing a letter by letter sort of expression of the name and vibration of the name, where that's not necessarily as appropriate. and particularly for the barbarous names, you're not really invoking the spirits per se. It's supposed to be read in the way that it's written. It's all good. It is. It has its own sort of music to it, and its own like beauty to it that it needs to be allowed to express. And you don't do that when you slow it down and do it letter by letter. And this is something that gets like lost in a lot of stuff. So essentially, what I'm saying here is that Golden Dawn added was two things, and one was to sort of superimpose the pentagram ritual on top of it, and to add this vibration characteristic. Whereas normally this ritual would just be done in sort of a prayer-like way, where it's just something that's recited, and there aren't really any specificities in the text of the ritual itself as to like the context that it should be happening. And Crowley goes into that in Liber Sumac when he's talking about using it to contact your holy guardian angel. And that's significant, yes, but it's not really what what the original thing sort of was. What's required here is a lot of practical experience with the ritual, and a lot of interesting phenomena tend to accompany it. I'm hesitant to like go too deeply into personal experiences, because I feel like if you hear someone talk about what they had happen when they do it, it sort of colors your own experience or whatever. And I'm not trying to put ideas in people's heads. But particularly I found like food and sleep are two things that I didn't need very much when I was doing it on a regular basis, or even on a daily basis. Like, there's definitely a reduced capacity in that regard. In a strictly practical sense, I would say that people really need to do it a lot. And this gets lost. It kind of turns into this big thing, because Crowley throws so much emphasis on it, like it's such a huge deal to do this ritual, and like it's such a big deal, which it is, like it's important, but it's really more important to do it as frequently as possible and regularly as possible. I remember reading, when I was doing research for this, I read a blog post by someone who I won't name, so to be nice, but they had written this big thing about the Bornless Invocation and what a big deal it was, and their whole interpretation of it, and blah, blah, blah. And then when you get to the end, you realize, oh, and this was what happened the time that I did it. It's like, what, you did it once? Like, no, like this is supposed to be a regular thing. Doing this once is not impressive at all, and shouldn't certainly entitle you to write pages and pages about what you think of the ritual. So, like with all of these things, the regular practice is important, but with this in particular, like I was talking about Crowley doing it in his head when he was in China, on a regular basis. It was like a constant thing. It was almost like a mantra with him, to be like doing it over and over and over in his head. And that's sort of like the way that we need to approach this. It's not something that happens. Crowley tells us to invoke often and inflame ourselves in praying and whatnot, and there's too much of a tendency, I think, to emphasize single actions in magic, whereas actually the only real results you get is with consistent pushing and pushing and pushing. So in Crowley's notes on this ritual, he mentions two of the other books in the sort of AA canon as being really important. And one of them is Liber 65, which is the Book of the Heart-Goat Serpent, which is about the adept's relationship with his angel, and it's the sort of HGA-oriented book. So that's important, and since Crowley is telling us we should be doing this ritual to contact our angel, it's obviously significant to look at that. But the one I'd like to emphasize really more is Liber 175, or Liber Sarte, which is his sort of interpretation of Bhakti Yoga. And basically this is the idea of, when it comes to like God worship, this is sort of where Thelema has its space for God worship, or whatever. He has the instructions in this book, is if you're to devote yourself to a particular deity or entity, or even to like nothingness in and of itself. Like he used an example of like, instead of maybe the image of the god you're trying to devote yourself to, if you're trying to do it like in a Buddhist vein, maybe you'd have like an empty shrine and just have it to this blank space or whatever. Like there's different